The 4-star general went completely still after I said my call sign. For a few seconds he didn't say a word. Neither did anyone else. The ballroom noise seemed to fade into the background. The clinking glasses, the quiet conversations, the soft music coming from the far side of the room. Then General Harlan Brooks slowly pushed back his chair and stood. He looked at me. Then he looked at my husband. And in a voice calm enough to make the silence feel even heavier, he asked, "Wait, he doesn't know who you are." My husband let out a nervous laugh. I felt my stomach drop. Because in that moment I knew exactly what was about to happen. And I knew there was no stopping it. But to explain why that question hit the room like a grenade, I need to take you back a little. My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 43 years old. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. For most people around town, I'm just another middle-aged woman with a dog, a mortgage, and a Costco membership. I buy groceries at King Soopers. I complain about traffic on Interstate 25. I spend way too much money at Home Depot whenever I convince myself I'm finally going to finish a project in the garage. Pretty ordinary life, at least now. But before all that, I spent nearly 2 decades flying Army helicopters, specifically UH-60 Blackhawks. And for a long time I loved every minute of it. The noise, the pressure, the responsibility, the people. Especially the people. Some of the finest men and women I've ever known sat beside me in those aircraft. The military gave me friendships that lasted longer than some marriages, including mine as it turned out. My husband Greg and I had been married for 11 years. The first 5 were good. Not perfect. Nobody's are, but good. Back then, Greg seemed genuinely proud of me. If we went to a barbecue, he'd introduce me as his wife, the helicopter pilot. If someone thanked me for my service, he'd smile. Sometimes he'd even tell stories about my career before I could. Looking back now, I think that version of Greg was real. I don't think he was pretending. I think life just changed him. Or maybe it exposed parts of him neither of us wanted to see. Greg worked in logistics management for a regional distribution company. For years he was moving upward. Good evaluations, better positions, raises, plans. Then things started stalling. A promotion went to someone younger. Then another. A company restructuring eliminated a position he had been counting on. Nothing catastrophic happened. No firing. No bankruptcy. Just years of small disappointments piling up. The kind that slowly wear grooves into a person's confidence. Around that same time I retired from the Army. People started inviting me to veterans events, military reunions, community ceremonies, mentorship programs. I never chased any of that attention. Honestly, I usually tried to avoid it. But it came anyway. And Greg noticed. At first he made little jokes. The harmless kind. Or at least that's what I told myself. If somebody asked about my service, he'd grin and say, "Don't encourage her. She already thinks she's special." Everyone would laugh, including me. Then the jokes got sharper. One afternoon I came home and found an old flight crew photograph missing from the hallway. A picture taken years earlier. My crew standing beside a Blackhawk after a long training exercise. I searched the house for 20 minutes before finding it leaning against a box in the garage. When I asked Greg about it, he shrugged. I figured guests didn't need the Rachel Donovan Museum tour every time they walked in. I remember standing there holding the frame. Not angry, just confused. The comment felt strange, like a joke missing a smile. A few months later, my old unit invited me to a reunion near Fort Carson. Nothing fancy. Just a gathering of former pilots and crew chiefs. I asked Greg if he wanted to come. He didn't even look up from his phone. No thanks. Why not? Because I don't want to spend an entire night listening to people talk about things that happened 20 years ago. I let it go. Again, that's what I did back then. I let things go. Because after a while you start convincing yourself that every marriage has rough patches. Every spouse gets insecure sometimes. Every relationship requires compromise. And maybe that's true. But compromise becomes dangerous when only one person is doing it. By the 6th year of our marriage, something else had changed. Whenever someone respected me, Greg seemed uncomfortable. Not always. Not openly. Just enough to notice. A compliment would land. Then he'd make a joke. Someone would ask about my flying career. Then he'd minimize it. Not directly. Just enough to shrink it. One 4th of July barbecue still sticks with me. A retired Marine thanked me for my service. Before I could respond, Greg jumped in. Relax. She wasn't storming beaches. Half the time she was probably pushing paperwork. Everybody laughed politely. I laughed too. But the Marine didn't. He just looked at Greg for a second, then changed the subject. That should have told me something. Instead, I ignored it. Because ignoring things was easier, at least in the short term. Then came the gala. The annual Military Appreciation Gala held at the Broadmoor Hotel. If you've never been there, it's beautiful. Historic. Elegant. The kind of place where retired generals mingle with local business leaders and active duty officers. The kind of place where uniforms still mean something. Greg insisted we attend. The night of the event, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror adjusting my dress uniform. Most of it still fit. Not perfectly. 43 is different from 23. My knees reminded me of that every morning. My lower back reminded me every time I carried groceries. But the uniform still fit. Mostly. Then I picked up the badges. Just a handful of metal and ribbon. Nothing extraordinary. At least not to me. I stared at them for longer than I should have. For one ridiculous moment, I considered leaving them off. Not because I was ashamed. Because I was tired. Tired of hearing comments. Tired of managing Greg's feelings. Tired of pretending certain remarks didn't bother me. Then I caught my own reflection. And something inside me finally pushed back. Not dramatically. Just quietly. I had earned those badges. Every single one. Nobody handed them to me. Nobody gifted them to me. Nobody did the work for me. So I pinned them on, grabbed my purse, and headed downstairs. What I didn't know was that before the night was over, those little pieces of metal would change everything. The Broadmoor always looks like a Christmas card somebody spent $1 million creating. Even in October. The mountains sat dark against the night sky. The lake reflected strings of warm lights. Valets moved steadily through the entrance, while guests in dress uniforms and evening gowns filtered into the ballroom. I remember standing near the entrance beside Greg watching people arrive. Some faces were familiar, others weren't. A retired colonel I hadn't seen in almost 8 years waved from across the room. An old crew chief from Fort Campbell stopped me to say hello. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt normal. Good even. Greg smiled, shook hands, made small talk. The version of him I missed showed up. The version that used to make me laugh. The version that made me marry him. That's the thing about difficult relationships. The good version never completely disappears. It just shows up often enough to keep you hoping. We found our assigned table near the center of the ballroom. 8 seats, white tablecloth, small American flag centerpiece, 2 retired officers and their wives, 1 active duty major, and us. Dinner wasn't scheduled for another half hour. Servers moved around offering drinks. Greg ordered bourbon. Nothing unusual. Then another. Still nothing unusual. I ordered sparkling water. Years of military flying had left me with a permanent distrust of feeling out of control. The conversation started naturally. Travel, grandkids, football, retirement. The major mentioned a training exercise at Fort Carson. One of the retired officers asked where I had served. Before I could answer, Greg jumped in. Rachel spent years flying helicopters. The officer nodded. That's impressive. Greg grinned. Depends who you ask. She still thinks she's Maverick. A few people chuckled politely. I smiled. The way women smile when they don't feel like explaining something. The conversation moved on. For a while. Then another round of drinks arrived. Greg leaned back in his chair. The bourbon was beginning to do what bourbon does. Not make him mean. Just louder. And more convinced that he was funny. The retired officer asked if I missed flying. I missed the people more than the aircraft, I said. That was true. The aircraft mattered. The people mattered more. Greg laughed. See, that's her way of saying she misses being the boss. Nobody laughed this time. Not because it was offensive. Because it wasn't particularly funny. The officer's wife gave me a small smile. The kind women give each other when they recognize something. The conversation shifted again. A few minutes later, another guest stopped by the table. Someone I vaguely recognized from years earlier. His eyes landed on my uniform. Rachel Wright, Blackhawk pilot. That's right. Well, thank you for your service. Before I could respond, Greg spoke. Don't encourage her. The guest laughed politely. Greg pointed toward one of my badges. I swear those things multiply every year. The man smiled awkwardly, then excused himself. As soon as he left, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. Not because of what Greg said, because I already knew where the evening was heading. I've learned something about disrespect. Rarely does it arrive all at once. Usually it arrives one tiny cut at a time. A joke, a comment, a correction nobody asked for. By itself, each one seems harmless. Stack enough of them together and eventually you're bleeding. The major sitting beside me noticed it too. I could tell. He wasn't looking at Greg anymore. He was studying his water glass. People do that when they feel uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. The first flashback hit me while I was staring at my salad. A memory from 3 years earlier. I had hung an old photograph in our hallway. Nothing dramatic. Just my flight crew standing beside a Black Hawk after a long exercise. A snapshot of people who had been important to me. A week later I came home and found it gone. After searching half the house, I discovered it leaning against storage bins in the garage. When I asked Greg about it, he shrugged. I figured guests didn't need a military history lesson every time they walked in. I remembered standing there holding the frame, trying to decide whether I was hurt or simply tired. I ended up feeling both. Back in the ballroom, dinner arrived. Chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. The usual banquet food. Not terrible. Not memorable. Greg had moved on to another bourbon. The major asked what aircraft I flew. Mostly UH-60 Blackhawks. Greg immediately jumped in. Sounds cooler than it is. I closed my eyes for half a second. Just half a second. The major glanced toward him. What do you mean? Greg laughed. People hear helicopter pilot and picture action movies. He pointed toward me with his fork. Half the time she was moving supplies training or doing paperwork. The table became very quiet. Not because what he said was entirely false. Every pilot spends time training. Every pilot spends time doing paperwork. That's reality. The problem wasn't the facts, the problem was the intention. I knew it. Everybody else knew it too. The retired officer's wife changed the subject. Bless her. She started asking about Colorado weather. The conversation recovered. But only barely. Then came another memory. 2 years earlier. My former unit invited me to a reunion. I asked Greg if he wanted to come. He didn't even pretend to consider it. I'm not spending a weekend listening to people talk about how amazing you are. The comment landed harder than he intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. I never figured that part out. I went alone, had a wonderful time, and spent most of the drive home wondering why I felt guilty for enjoying myself. Back in the ballroom, dessert arrived. Cheesecake. Coffee. More drinks. The room was getting louder. Greg was getting louder too. The retired officer asked about one of the badges on my uniform. It wasn't even a particularly important one. Just a simple aviation qualification badge. Before I could answer, Greg chuckled. Honestly, some of those things are basically participation trophies. The words landed on the table like a dropped wrench. Nobody moved. Nobody smiled. Nobody laughed. The retired officer stared at him. The major stared at his coffee. The officer's wife looked directly at me. I wanted to disappear. Not because I was embarrassed by my service. Because I was embarrassed for my husband. That feeling is hard to describe. When somebody you love keeps revealing parts of themselves you'd rather not see. Greg didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't care. He took another sip of bourbon, then pointed toward my uniform. You know, Rachel always acts humble, but she likes the attention. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Just exhaustion. A deep exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying the same emotional weight for years. I looked around the ballroom. Military families, veterans, people who understood sacrifice, people who understood service, people who understood respect. And sitting beside me was the one person who seemed determined to turn my life into a punchline. Then movement near the entrance caught my eye. The room changed almost immediately. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. People straightened in their chairs. A familiar figure had entered the ballroom. Tall, silver-haired, commanding without trying. General Harlan Brooks, retired 4-star, one of the most respected officers of his generation. I recognized him instantly. Years earlier, I'd seen him speak at a leadership conference. Most people only knew him from television interviews and military events. But within Army aviation circles, his reputation ran deeper than that. He moved through the ballroom greeting people, shaking hands, stopping at tables, listening more than talking. As he slowly worked his way across the room, I felt something unexpected. Concern. Not excitement. Concern. Because Greg was still drinking, still talking, still performing. And for some reason I had a feeling those two worlds were about to collide. A few minutes later, General Brooks started moving toward our section of the ballroom. I looked down at my coffee cup, and the only thought running through my head was, please, Lord, not tonight. General Harlan Brooks didn't move through the ballroom the way most important people do. He wasn't trying to attract attention. That was the strange thing. The attention followed him anyway. People stood when he approached. Not because they were required to. Because respect had become a habit. I watched him make his way from table to table, stopping, listening, asking questions, remembering names. The kind of leadership that stays with people long after the rank disappears. Greg noticed him too. Of course he did. Almost everyone in the room had. He straightened in his chair and adjusted his jacket. Suddenly he looked very interested in appearing impressive. I stared down into my coffee. Part of me hoped the general would pass us by. The other part knew he wouldn't. Army aviation is a surprisingly small world. Sooner or later everybody crosses paths. A few minutes later, General Brooks reached our table. Conversation stopped. People rose slightly from their seats to shake hands. Introductions were exchanged. The general greeted everyone warmly. No speech, no performance, just genuine interest. When he reached me, he paused. His eyes moved briefly across my uniform. Not staring, just observing, the way military people tend to do. He shook my hand. Good evening. Good evening, sir. His grip was firm, his expression pleasant. Nothing unusual, at least not yet. Greg immediately leaned forward. The bourbon had made him confident, or maybe careless. Probably both. General Brooks, it's an honor. The general nodded politely. Greg smiled. My wife still likes wearing all the old hardware. He gestured toward my uniform. I keep telling her she's going to set off airport security one day. A few people forced small laughs. The general didn't, not because he seemed offended, because he seemed distracted. His attention had shifted. His eyes settled briefly on one particular badge, then another. I noticed the exact moment something registered. A tiny change. Nothing dramatic, just enough. The kind of expression people make when a face suddenly seems familiar but they can't quite place it. The general looked back at me. What unit were you with? I answered. He nodded slowly. Then his eyes returned to my uniform. A few seconds passed. The table remained quiet. Finally, he asked, Ma'am, what was your call sign? My stomach tightened. Of all the questions he could have asked, that wasn't the one I expected. Not because the answer was secret. Because nobody had asked me that in years. After retirement call signs disappear, you stop hearing them. You stop thinking about them. They become part of another life. Greg chuckled. Now this I want to hear. I ignored him. The general was still waiting. I hesitated for only a second, then answered. Shadowhawk. The reaction was immediate, not loud. Not dramatic, but immediate. The general's expression changed completely. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink for a moment. The table fell silent. I felt every pair of eyes turning toward us. The general studied my face, almost like he was comparing the woman sitting in front of him with a memory from years ago. Then very slowly he stood straighter. His gaze shifted toward Greg, and he asked the question that would change the rest of the evening. Wait. The room seemed to stop breathing. He doesn't know who you are. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Greg laughed first. A nervous, uncertain laugh. The kind people use when they don't understand what's happening. What do you mean? He asked. The general looked genuinely surprised. Your husband doesn't know, Greg smiled. Know what? The general glanced back at me. I immediately knew what he was thinking, and I immediately wished he wasn't. I gave a small shake of my head, a silent request. Please don't. Not here, not tonight, not like this. For a moment I thought he understood. Then he looked back at Greg. Interesting, interesting. One word. That was all he said. But somehow it made everything worse, because now everybody at the table was curious. The retired colonel leaned forward slightly. The major stopped pretending to focus on his coffee. Even the servers nearby seemed slower as they moved through the room. People could sense something unusual. Greg still looked confused. Should I know something? The general studied him carefully. I noticed something in his expression. Not anger. Not judgment. Confusion. As though he couldn't understand how a husband could sit beside his wife for 11 years and miss something important. Finally, he looked at me again. Shadowhawk. I nodded. Yes, sir. A faint smile crossed his face. Not a happy smile. More like disbelief. I haven't heard that call sign in a long time. The retired colonel spoke up. Should we know it? The general paused. For a second I thought he might ignore the question. Instead he answered carefully. Some of us remember it. That only increased everyone's curiosity. Greg laughed again. Only now the confidence was gone. You guys are making this sound like she's Batman. Nobody joined in. The silence after his joke felt painful. The general's eyes never left him. Then he asked me a question. 2018, Rocky Mountain Winter Rescue Mission, correct? I nodded once. The memory hit instantly. Snow, wind, darkness, radio traffic, the smell of aviation fuel. A night I hadn't thought about in a long time. The general exhaled slowly. I thought so. Greg looked from him to me, then back again. The smile he'd been wearing all evening was beginning to crack. For the first time uncertainty appeared in his eyes. The kind of uncertainty that comes when reality starts moving in a direction you didn't expect. What rescue mission? Greg asked. The general didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked at me, almost asking permission. I felt trapped. Part of me wanted to shut the entire conversation down. Stand up. Change the subject. Walk away. For years I had been doing exactly that. Managing discomfort. Protecting people from consequences. Protecting Greg most of all. Even when he didn't deserve it. The habit was hard to break. The general seemed to recognize my hesitation, so he kept his answer simple. There was a pilot with that call sign. He nodded toward me. One of the finest Army aviators I've ever heard about. The retired colonel's eyebrows lifted. The major looked openly interested now. Greg stared at me, completely confused. Rachel, I could hear something new in his voice. Not admiration, not pride, something closer to concern. The realization that maybe there were parts of my life he had never bothered to understand. The general continued carefully. No classified stories, no secrets. He smiled faintly. But some names stay with people. The room remained quiet. The tension wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was personal. Because everyone could sense what was happening. This wasn't about military awards. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't even about a rescue mission. It was about a husband realizing he might know less about his wife than complete strangers did. And judging by the look on Greg's face, he was starting to realize it too. For years he had reduced my career to jokes. Training flights. Paperwork. Supply runs. Little comments delivered with a smile. Now he sat across from a room full of military professionals who clearly knew something he didn't. For the first time all night, Greg looked uncomfortable. Truly uncomfortable. And something inside me shifted. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Just clarity. Because I suddenly understood something. The problem had never been that Greg didn't know. The problem was that he never wanted to know. General Brooks glanced around the table. Then back at me. His voice softened. Rachel, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to tell them a story. My heart sank. Because I already knew exactly which story he meant. And once it started, there would be no putting it back in the box. For a moment I considered saying no. That probably sounds strange. Most people think they know exactly how they'd react if someone finally stood up for them after years of disrespect. But real life isn't that simple. Especially when the person sitting across from you is your husband. The man you shared holidays with. Road trips. Hospital waiting rooms. Mortgage payments. Quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee together. You don't stop caring about someone just because they hurt you. Sometimes that's exactly what makes it hurt. General Brooks was still looking at me, waiting, giving me the choice. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Not because people were trying to eavesdrop, because they already were. I glanced at Greg. For the first time all evening, he wasn't smiling. He looked confused, uneasy, maybe even worried. Part of me wanted to protect him. That old instinct again. Smooth things over, change the subject, make everyone comfortable. Then I remembered every time I had done exactly that. Every joke I ignored. Every insult I explained away. Every moment I chose peace over honesty. And where had it gotten me? Sitting at a table where my husband had spent half the evening turning my career into a punchline. I looked back at the general, then nodded. Only what's already public. The general smiled gently. Of course. He remained standing. Not because he was giving a speech. Just because everyone was already looking at him. He rested one hand on the back of his chair. In 2018, he began, there was a winter rescue operation in the Rockies. Immediately I knew exactly where this was going. The memories came back so fast it felt physical. The cold. The darkness. The endless radio chatter. The fear nobody wanted to admit out loud. The general continued. A training accident left several service members stranded during a severe storm. Nobody interrupted. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Visibility was poor. Winds were getting worse by the hour. Across the table, the retired colonel nodded slightly. He understood what those words meant. Any pilot would. The general looked around the room. The conditions were bad enough that several crews believed attempting a rescue would create more casualties. Greg shifted in his chair. I could see him listening now. Actually listening. Probably for the first time all night. The general glanced toward me. Rachel volunteered for a second attempt. I lowered my eyes. I hated hearing these stories told publicly. Not because they were inaccurate. Because military service is rarely as heroic as people imagine. Most of the time you're just trying to do your job. The general continued. The mission wasn't glamorous. That made me smile slightly. That part was certainly true. There were no television cameras, no reporters, no movie soundtrack. A few people chuckled softly. It was cold, dangerous, exhausting work. Now the room was completely silent. The general described the operation without exaggeration. A stranded group. Rapidly worsening weather. Limited visibility. A narrow window before conditions became impossible. He never made it sound like an action movie. Because it wasn't. The truth was more impressive. Real people making difficult decisions. Real risk. Real consequences. Then he said something that surprised me. Rachel wasn't the most fearless pilot involved. I looked up. The general smiled. She was terrified. Laughter rippled through the room. including mine, because it was true. I had been terrified. Anybody claiming otherwise would be lying. The general pointed toward me. The difference is she went anyway. That landed harder than any dramatic speech could have, because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving while afraid. The room stayed quiet. The major beside me looked genuinely fascinated now. The retired colonel's wife dabbed at her eyes. General Brooks continued. 2 flights that night. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered every minute, every radio call, every checklist, every gust of wind that rattled the aircraft. Every second wondering whether we were about to make a terrible mistake. 9 people came home. The general paused. 9 families got another phone call. Nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Respectful. Heavy. The kind of silence that follows truth. Then the general added something else. For her actions, Rachel received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Several people inhaled sharply. Even those without military backgrounds recognized the significance. Greg's eyes widened, slowly, almost reluctantly, as if his brain was struggling to fit this information into the version of me he'd built over the years. The general looked at him. Most people who earn one don't spend much time talking about it. Greg swallowed. I noticed it because I knew him so well. He only did that when he was uncomfortable. She never told me, he said quietly. The words weren't defensive. Not yet. Just surprised. Before I could stop myself, I answered. I tried. The room became even quieter. Greg looked at me. What? I tried. The words came easier now. More than once. His forehead creased. I continued. You didn't want to hear it. That hurt him. I could see it. Because somewhere deep down he knew it was true. Years ago I'd started telling him about the rescue operation. Not to brag. Just because it had been one of the hardest nights of my career. Halfway through the story he'd changed the subject. Another time he'd joked that military awards were mostly paperwork. After a while I stopped trying. Not because I was angry. Because I got tired. The general's expression softened. Then something changed. Like he had remembered something. He looked directly at Greg. I think we've actually met before. Greg blinked. What? 2 years ago? The general smiled politely. Military appreciation fundraiser. I immediately saw recognition appear on Greg's face. The fundraiser. I remembered it too. General Brooks continued. You were talking with several officers. Greg's posture stiffened. The general wasn't smiling anymore. You mentioned your wife's service. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a glass. The room was completely still. The general spoke calmly. You said she mostly handled training paperwork and supply flights. Greg's face lost color. Not dramatically, just enough. I suddenly remembered that conversation too. At the time I'd been across the room speaking with another veteran. I hadn't heard the details, only pieces. Now I understood. The general continued. You seemed very certain she hadn't done anything particularly significant. Nobody looked at me anymore. Every eye in the room had shifted toward Greg. And for the first time all evening there was nowhere for him to hide. Greg opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I didn't mean... The general raised a hand gently, not to silence him, to stop him from digging deeper. I remember it because it bothered me. The words weren't angry. That somehow made them stronger. You weren't criticizing a stranger. He glanced toward me. You were talking about your wife. Nobody spoke. Greg stared at the table. And in that moment something clicked for me. Something important. For years I had wondered whether I was imagining things. Whether I was too sensitive. Too emotional. Too defensive. Maybe the jokes weren't really insults. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I should have thicker skin. Sitting there in that ballroom surrounded by people who had watched the entire evening unfold, I finally saw it clearly. I hadn't been too sensitive. I'd been too willing to excuse behavior that should never have become normal. The realization hit harder than anything the general had said. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. And for the first time in years, I wasn't questioning myself. I was questioning why I had tolerated it for so long. Nobody spoke for several seconds after General Brooks finished. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was honest. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people suddenly understands exactly what's going on. Greg stared at the table, then at me, then at the general. His face had gone pale. I could almost see his mind racing, searching for a way out. A different explanation. A misunderstanding. Anything. Finally, he let out a short laugh. The sound landed badly. Even he seemed to realize it. Well, he said, forcing a smile, this is getting blown way out of proportion. Nobody answered. Not the general. Not the retired colonel. Not the major. Nobody. Greg shifted in his chair. I mean, come on, we were joking around. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And suddenly I realized something. He genuinely believed that explanation should work. Because it always had before. Every time he crossed a line. Every time he embarrassed me. Every time he minimized something important to me. The conversation always ended the same way. He called it a joke. I accepted it. Life moved on. Only tonight wasn't following the usual script. "Rachel," he said, turning toward me. "You know I was joking." I didn't answer. For years I had rushed to make him comfortable, to reassure him, to smooth over tension. Now I simply sat there, waiting. Greg laughed again, less confidently this time. "Seriously, everybody's acting like I committed a crime." The retired colonel finally spoke. "No one's saying that." His voice remained calm. "But jokes are usually funny." A few people shifted in their seats. Greg looked embarrassed, then defensive. A dangerous combination. He pointed toward me. "She never told me any of this." There it was. The first attempt to redirect responsibility. I wasn't surprised. People rarely abandon old habits under pressure. General Brooks folded his hands. "She just said she tried." Greg immediately shook his head. No, she never explained it like that." I felt something strange. Not anger, not even resentment. Just distance. As if I were watching someone else's argument. Greg turned toward me again. "Rachel, if you'd told me it was a big deal," I interrupted him. "The first time all evening. The first time in years, if I was being honest. I shouldn't have needed a presentation." The words came out quietly. Nobody moved. Greg blinked. "What?" "I shouldn't have needed to convince my husband that my life mattered." The room became very still. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I was simply tired of pretending. Greg opened his mouth, closed it, then leaned back in his chair. For a second I thought maybe he understood. Then his expression hardened. Not completely. Just enough. The old defensiveness returning. So now I'm the bad guy. There it was. The question. The one I'd heard in different forms for years. Whenever accountability appeared, somehow the conversation became about his feelings. I took a slow breath. Across the table, the retired colonel's wife watched quietly. Not judging, just listening. I looked directly at Greg. "You want to know what's interesting?" He crossed his arms. "What?" "I never expected you to understand every part of my military career." He frowned. "I expected you to respect it." The words hung in the air. Simple. Direct. Impossible to argue with. Greg looked away first. That almost never happened. He glanced toward the general, then toward the major, then toward the rest of the table, as if searching for allies. Nobody came to his rescue. Because nobody could. The facts were sitting right there in front of us. Years of small comments. Years of dismissiveness. Years of pretending it was harmless. Then something unexpected happened. A voice came from the neighboring table. "Well." Everyone turned. A tall, gray-haired man stood holding a coffee cup. For a second I didn't recognize him. Then I laughed. Mike Callahan grinned. Former Black Hawk pilot. Former practical joker. Former pain in my neck. We hadn't seen each other in almost 6 years. "Good to see you, Shadowhawk." That earned a few smiles around the room. Even General Brooks looked amused. Mike glanced toward Greg, then scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, this whole thing explains something I've been wondering about." Greg looked miserable. "What?" Mike shrugged. "A couple years ago I remember hearing you tell somebody Rachel mostly flew mail around the state." A few people chuckled. "Not cruelly? Just naturally," Mike continued. Which confused me. The laughter grew slightly. Because I distinctly remember being on one of those helicopters she supposedly used for mail delivery. Even I laughed. The tension cracked a little. Not enough to change anything. Just enough to let people breathe. Mike wasn't attacking Greg. That made it worse. He was simply telling the truth. Truth rarely needs help. Greg forced a smile. "I was exaggerating. Clearly." More soft laughter. The retired colonel's wife covered her mouth. The major looked like he was trying not to grin. Greg sank lower in his chair, and for the first time all evening I think he realized this wasn't about one bad joke. It was about a pattern. A long one. A pattern everyone else could now see. The thing I'd been living with for years had become visible. And once visible it couldn't be hidden again. Greg turned back toward me. His voice sounded smaller now. "Rachel, I didn't mean to hurt you." I believed him. That was the complicated part. I genuinely believed he never woke up each morning planning to hurt me. But intent only goes so far. At some point, results matter too. I folded my hands in my lap. "I know." He looked relieved. For about 2 seconds, then I continued. "But you did." The relief vanished. "I know you didn't wake up thinking about ways to tear me down." My voice remained calm. Steady. But after a while intent stops mattering. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. I continued. "Every time someone respected me, you turned it into a joke." Greg stared at the table. The photo in the hallway. Silence. The reunion. More silence. The barbecue. His jaw tightened. The comments in the car. The comments at church. The comments tonight. Each example landed softly, like stones dropping into water. No shouting. No tears. Just facts. The truth sounded surprisingly simple once spoken aloud. Greg rubbed his forehead. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked old. Not physically. Emotionally. Worn out. Cornered by his own choices. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't realize it was that bad." I nodded. "I know." And I did know. Because if he had realized it, he would have had to face what he'd become. That realization hurt him more than anything else said that night. A server quietly cleared dessert plates. Someone in the ballroom laughed at a distant table. Life continued around us, yet our entire marriage felt suspended in that moment. Greg looked at me. What happens now? I thought about that. Really thought about it. Then I stood. The room remained silent. I turned toward General Brooks. "Thank you, sir." He nodded respectfully. Then I looked around the table, at the people who had witnessed everything. The people who had shown me more respect in one evening than I'd shown myself in years. Finally, I looked at Greg. "When we get home," I said quietly, "we're going to have the first completely honest conversation of our marriage." His eyes widened. "Are you threatening me?" I almost laughed. Almost. "No." I picked up my purse. "I'm finally done threatening myself into staying quiet." Then I walked away from the table. Not out of anger, out of necessity. A few minutes later, I stepped outside onto the terrace. Cold Colorado air hit my face. The mountains stood dark against the night sky. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. And for the first time in years, I wasn't wondering whether I was the problem. The drive home was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The heavy kind. The kind where two people are sitting 3 feet apart but feel miles away. The lights of Colorado Springs blurred past the windshield. Traffic was light. Most people were home already, watching television, getting ready for bed, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my entire marriage felt like it had been pulled apart and laid on a table for inspection. Greg drove. I looked out the passenger window. Neither of us spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. I never wanted that to happen. I kept my eyes on the dark outline of the mountains. "I know." A few more minutes passed. Then he tried again. "I didn't know he was going to say all that." "I know." His grip tightened on the steering wheel. I feel like everybody was judging me. That one almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was revealing. Even now, after everything, the thing bothering him most was how he felt. Not how I felt. Not what he'd done. How it looked. I turned toward him. "Do you know what the worst part was?" He glanced over. "What?" "The fact that none of it surprised me." That landed harder than I expected. He didn't answer. Because there wasn't much to say. We reached home around 11:40 p.m. The house felt strangely unfamiliar when we walked inside. Like we'd returned from a long trip. Greg loosened his tie. I took off my shoes. Neither of us rushed upstairs. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals. The same table where we'd planned vacations, paid bills, and argued over paint colors. A clock on the microwave quietly counted the minutes. 11:52, 12:14, 12:47. The conversation lasted for hours. Longer than either of us expected. At first, Greg was defensive. Then angry. Then sad. Then defensive again. He cycled through every emotion available. I probably did too. At one point, he blamed alcohol. At another point, he blamed stress. Then he blamed embarrassment. Finally, somewhere after 1 in the morning, the excuses started running out. That's when the truth appeared. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Greg admitted he'd become jealous. The word seemed painful for him to say. Jealous. Not of my military career itself. Of what it represented. Purpose. Respect. Identity. People still admired things I had done. Meanwhile, he felt invisible. Forgotten. Stuck. I kept feeling like I was falling behind. His voice cracked slightly. I believed him. That was the difficult part. His pain was real. I never doubted that. The problem was what he chose to do with it. At 2:17 a.m., I remember looking at the microwave clock and realizing we'd been talking for more than 2 hours. Neither of us had won. Neither of us felt better, but at least we were finally being honest. For once. Greg stared at the table. I think I wanted people to see me. I nodded. I know. I felt like every time somebody praised you, it reminded me of what I wasn't. The words hung in the air. There it was. The real problem. Not my service. Not the badges. Not the stories. His own disappointment. For years, he had been fighting a battle that had nothing to do with me. Unfortunately, I had become the target. I reached across the table and touched his hand. Not because everything was fixed, because compassion and boundaries can exist at the same time. Your pain was real, Greg. He looked up. What I did with it wasn't. I shook my head. No. The room became quiet again. Then I said the hardest thing I'd said all night. Your pain was real. What you did with it was still your choice. Neither of us slept much. 3 weeks later we separated. Not dramatically. No screaming. No lawyers immediately showing up. No scene in a parking lot. Just two exhausted people admitting something wasn't working. I rented a small apartment in Monument about 20 minutes north of Colorado Springs. The place wasn't fancy. 1 bedroom, small balcony, a view of the Front Range if you stood at exactly the right angle. The first night there felt strange. For 11 years I had fallen asleep beside another person. Now the apartment was silent. I cried more than I expected. People don't talk enough about that part. Even when leaving is the right decision, it still hurts. I questioned myself constantly. Should I have spoken up years earlier? Should I have fought harder? Should I have left sooner? Should I have stayed longer? There were no easy answers. Healing never happens in a straight line. Some mornings I felt strong. Other mornings I felt completely lost. But gradually things improved. I joined a support group for women veterans. I started mentoring younger helicopter pilots again. Once a month I met with service members transitioning into civilian life. Helping them helped me. A funny thing happened during that period. I stopped thinking about who I used to be, and started appreciating who I still was. One Saturday afternoon I unpacked a box that had been sitting unopened for months. Inside was the old flight crew photograph from years ago, the one Greg had moved to the garage. I stared at it for a long time. Then I hung it in my hallway. No explanation, no apology, no hesitation. Just a photograph exactly where I wanted it. Greg called occasionally, texted more often. Some messages were angry, others were full of regret. A few sounded like the man I married. Months later I finally responded to one. Just one. I wrote, I didn't need a perfect husband. I needed one who wasn't threatened by my success. Then I put my phone down. That was enough. Looking back now, I don't think aging ruins people. I think bitterness does. Life disappoints all of us eventually. Dreams change. Bodies change. Careers change. The real test is what we do with that disappointment. Some people grow through it. Others start looking for someone smaller to stand on. The saddest part wasn't that Greg didn't know who I was. The saddest part was that somewhere along the way he stopped wanting to know. And once that happens, a marriage becomes a lonely place. Respect isn't something you give once and forget about. It's a daily choice, a habit, a practice. And when someone needs you to shrink so they can feel bigger, that's not love. That's a warning. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, you're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. Take care of yourself and take care of the people who truly celebrate who you are.